I'd like to introduce my colleagues, Susana and Andrea from Nathan campus at Griffith.
Okay, so we're going to first give you an overview of the session. So we'd like to first give you an idea of the Australian context, so the where, so to speak. Then the question of what. So what is bilingualism? What degrees and types of bilingualism do we have, or do people talk about? Then talk about advantages and potential disadvantages for children growing up bilingually. And then finally talk about the how, so give some practical ideas of how you could potentially support parents and things like those. Okay, so I'll start with the where, Australian context. As it happens, Australia is still one of the main countries of migration. So there's over 6 million migrants born in over 200 countries. And the last census, the 2011 census, actually showed that the number of people who speak a language other than English at home has increased. So it's now sitting at around 19% of the population over 5 years of age speak a language other than English at home in Australia. So that this is essentially every fifth person. So that's quite a large number. There's still a lot of migrants from English-speaking countries, but you can see with that number that there is a whole lot of other languages being spoken, and there's actually more than 300 languages, and that's not including the indigenous languages being spoken in Australia. Of those languages, of those 300 languages being spoken, the largest group is the speakers of Mandarin, which roughly is about 4% of the population. So it is a challenge to have so many languages if you want to provide support to all of those languages, and we might address that issue a little bit later. Now, in terms of thinking about languages, there is this idea that not all languages are considered to be equal. So Ruiz, for instance, has already a while ago talked about 3 policy orientations, namely one, that language is a right, so people have the right to speak their own language, which is in particular important if you're looking at some countries where language policies have tried to hinder people from speaking their own languages. Language is a problem, so is that a problem if people speak another language at home? There's still a lot of people who might think that, but also language as a resource. So in Australia you can make a distinction between, well, roughly, modern foreign languages, and these are the languages which would be the ones being taught in school, but then the indigenous languages, obviously, and the migrant community languages, and by that we mean those languages which are actually being spoken by other people in their homes. And those languages, for obvious reasons, do overlap with some of those, or with the modern foreign languages. But the number of migrant and community languages in Australia is a lot larger than the number that is being taught in school. So if you think about those languages in terms of these up here, the foreign languages would be, the modern foreign languages would be the ones which are considered the resource, but many of the other migrant and community languages are often considered a problem. Before we head into real what is bilingualism, I would like to ask who considers, or who of you do consider yourself as bilingual? Well, there's actually no agreement on that point in the literature. So you get a whole range of what bilingualism is, and
so roughly people say the ability to speak 2 languages. Now, despite what you may think, very few people can speak the 2 languages at the same level of proficiency. And unbilinguals, people who have this very high level of proficiency in both languages, are really rare. There are very few people that have the same level of proficiency. And we say 2, but it's 2 or more, because some people grow up with 3 languages or even more. So this is our working definition, because the jury is out there in the research. People come with all different sort of ideas. But the point is that across the world happens what we have in this environment here. Well, of course, you're all language teachers, or many of you are language teachers, but bilingualism is the norm. It's not the exception. It is only when people have this monolingual framework that they think, or mindset, that they think that bilingualism is strange. It is actually more common than monolingualism is. But of course we have degrees of bilingualism, And you might all be in some areas, in some skills, at different points of the continuum, if we can call it the continuum. Even if you have mastery of two languages, you might be able to read in one and write, or communicate fluently, and not write at all, especially with the scripted languages. So we have a number of degrees. Passive bilinguals, children or adults that understand the language but are not able to reply. And you find this a lot in Australia with young children of migrant parents. When they understand the language, they can obey or not, or ignore, but they don't reply in the language. So this would be passive bilinguals. Or people who have basic skills in the language, they can speak, or in the case of children, they can play with other children, but it's at a very basic level. Then, of course, we have intermediate, advanced, and native. And as I said, native would be indistinguishable from a monolingual child. And then, of course, we have types of bilingualism. So we have simultaneous, and this is when children are being raised in two languages at the same time. They might be going to childcare center and they interact in English in the childcare center, but at home everything happens in one language or two. If the parents speak different languages, the one parent, one language, for example, that we're going to describe later. Or we have successive bilingualism, and these are type 1, home language only, and then when they start going to childcare center, they will introduce the majority language. This was my case. When I came to Australia, I had a 3-month-old baby, and she didn't get much exposure to English at all in the first 2 years, and then she started going to childcare, and in 2 weeks, English was her stronger language, because everything happened in that language. But it was type 1's successive bilingualism, or type 2 is the dominant language only. So you introduce English or the majority language to the child, but the problem is that this might restrict communication between family members, and we've seen that a lot in the workshops we've done for the community. Parents who follow the advice of switching into English with the children, and then they lose the ability to communicate because the English doesn't get very advanced, and the children don't feel the motivation to speak the minority language. So it's easier, the younger the children are, the easier it is to convince them that they have to speak the home language. According to some studies, for a child to be balanced bilingual, they need about 70% of the home input in the home language. 70% is a lot. So if you're going to cope with 3 languages, it's really a challenge. Probably the safest method is what I had at home, Spanish, and Andrea, German, and this is the language that we speak with our partners and then with the children. So it's the easiest one, but you do need strong nerves because everyone around you is telling you that the child is going to be confused. I even had people in the supermarket stopping me and saying, why are you speaking another language? It's so good for the child, they live in Australia. So you do have these sort of things, and people do come with the worry that maybe the children will be disadvantaged later. So it is a real worry, it's not just something that can be dismissed, and that's why we've been doing workshops in the community as well, to support the idea that children can cope with more than one language. And of course then we have other patterns, mixed languages, and we've seen that a lot in some Asian communities where they speak different dialects of Chinese in addition to English and maybe Malay, and children seem to cope with that. There is a mixture of languages in the environment, and then of course immersion, and this in Australia I think in most states starts at the high school level.
Yeah,
but
my son does immersion, so that's high school, it's 8, 9 and 10.
Yeah.
And
Which,
beyond that?
Not the immersion program.
no,
Immersion program.
because I think children are going to be disadvantaged for the OP. And it's such a pity, and it's a pity that it starts late, but in countries like Canada you do have French immersion from primary school or English immersion in Quebec. So these are programs that I don't think we have in Australia, at least not in Queens. Okay, now, After this short introduction, what would you say about the chances of this child becoming bilingual? My child is learning Japanese in childcare. They have a Japanese teacher coming in for 2 hours every week. But it also makes you think about the situation in Australian schools. How many hours a child has in the languages that you're teaching? 1 hour a week or 2 hours? 90 minutes a week.
Supposed to be 90 minutes.
Okay, so a lot has to be recommended.
Mm.
Yeah, so when you look at the fact that the child needs 30% of the time immersion in a particular language to get to a good level of proficiency, it really becomes obvious that 90 minutes is certainly not enough. And finally, my children are learning Samoan. Their grandma speaks Samoan to them all the time. Well, this would be the ideal situation, so you just leave the children with the grandparents and they'll teach them, yeah.
Okay, so we'll start with the advantages. No, we'll start with the misconceptions and myths, actually. You've already mentioned the first one, I think, that children will be confused. So research has shown that that is not the case. So at a very early age, they can keep the languages separate. So at latest by 4 or 5 years of age, they should be able to do that. And it's completely normal in the early process of acquiring, if they are simultaneously learning the language in the early years, to do some mixing, but that is a completely normal process. And that's linking into the second myth, that children will only mix the 2 languages. Yes, they do so at some point. They might, but I mean, I've got a 3 and a 5-year-old, and they are both beyond the mixing phase. So I would say that they both can really, really well separate out. If they speak to an English-only speaker, they will only speak English. If they speak to a German-only speaker, they will only speak German. If they speak to us, well, they may mix, because they know we understand them. And that's a completely normal thing, because in bilingual societies you get that code mixing quite a lot anyway. The children really grow up simultaneously with the 2 languages. They will just acquire them, because language acquisition is quite different from actual language learning, which people do later in life. So there's a whole research on showing that first language acquisition is a completely different process than what happens when you do second language acquisition, or learning in that case. It's more learning for second language, where you have to have instruction. So there's this idea that there is a critical or sensitive period during which children can just pick up language from the environment without having structured instruction. And this sensitive period, well, it depends on which area you're looking at. If you're looking at sound system, it kind of closes earlier than if you're looking at vocabulary development, which essentially can go on all your life. But usually people would say as soon as you hit the early teenager years, that sensitive period is over. So after that, when children probably go to high school, they will be second language learners. They cannot acquire the language anymore in the same way they have acquired the first language.
Thanks so much, Susana and Andrea.